Continuous threat exposure management is the new phrase for what we used to call vulnerability management programs, and the distinction between the products and the programs. Gartner is recognizing what has been in our security programs for 20 years, in that inventory is control number one. We've all told our auditors we've got it under control, and we've all pointed to the CMDB as the tool to accommodate that control, but at the same time that we've known that the CMDB is wildly inaccurate. Vulnerability Management Program 2.0 is here. It's called CTEM, Continuous Threat Exposure Management. The foundation of that is a strong inventory.
Welcome to the Security Strategist Podcast, where we have a weekly conversation with people impacting the enterprise tech landscape. My name is Richard Steenan. I'm an industry analyst, author, and curator of lots of data on the cybersecurity industry. So today we are speaking with JJ Guy, who's CEO and co-founder of Sevco Security, about the evolution of vulnerability management into continuous threat exposure management. Welcome, JJ.
Thank you, Richard. It's good to be here. Good to see you again.
Yeah, I know. It's great. So let's delve into this Gartner 4-letter acronym, because they're running out of 3-letter acronyms. CTEM. Help us understand, what it means to you and how we can start thinking about it in terms of kind of an extension of VM.
Continuous threat exposure management. The other phrase you're going to hear along these lines is exposure assessment platforms. The parallel here is exposure assessment platforms is similar to what we used to call vulnerability assessment platforms. And continuous threat exposure management is the new phrase for what we used to call vulnerability management programs, and the distinction between the products and the programs. I think of CTEM just as vulnerability management 2.0. 10 or 15 years ago, the only product we had was the vulnerability assessment platform, Rapid7, Qualys, Tenable, and that was horizontally integrated. It was the one product you bought to analyze your infrastructure for vulnerabilities, largely by scanning the enterprise network. But in the years since then, the enterprise network is degrading and disappearing. The enterprise perimeter is very different than it was at that point. The attack surfaces and complexity of our network enterprises is exploding. And that has led to a whole slew of vertically integrated vulnerability analysis tools. That's either a handful of different platforms all reporting CVEs. Maybe you got this platform for your network, you got this platform for your things in the cloud, you got this platform for your end user endpoint agents, another platform for your core servers. Everybody's managing it a little bit differently. But at the same time, you have another platform for cloud, you've got another platform for data, another platform for AppSec and external attack surface management, and not enough remediation capacity to even start to fix all the different vulnerabilities raised. Like, how do you even begin to manage all of that? That is CTEM, Continuous Threat Exposure Management. Now, in Gartner's lingo, they're giving it 5 phases. The first is scoping. Within every one of those different attack surfaces, define the attack surfaces that you need to cover, and start to understand the scope of what you have to manage in your own individual enterprise. Second is discovery. Within every one of those different categories of attack surfaces, making sure that your inventory and all the assets and the vulnerabilities all on those, and then aggregate them into a single spot. There is prioritization.
To interrupt, I discover, or I talk to people all the time, that during that discovery phase, they realize they have to rescope because they discover things they didn't know that they had.
Oh, absolutely. That happens nonstop. Because even just knowing what you've got is a huge hurdle. And what ends up happening is you start to drive scoping and discovery as an actual activity and manage that very closely. It ends up being iterative, and every little bit of extra thing you learn helps you appreciate, there's a gap over here, there's a gap over here, there's a gap over here, and then working to find those gaps.
Cool. So there's a recursive do loop inside this, these pillars.
Yes, absolutely. And that is part of what's foundational in CTEM programs. Gartner has started to talk about in CASM, and CASM products as being foundational to CTEM. for exactly the reason that you're describing. And, Chasm, there's a subset of, vendors out there who are calling themselves Chasm that are inventory focused and spend a lot of time focusing on inventory to make sure that it's comprehensive and then analyzing that inventory for Chasm vulnerabilities. And, as the Magic Quadrant and the definition of exposure assessment platforms all kind of iterates and comes together, Gartner's recognizing what has been in our security programs for 20 years, in that inventory is control number one. And no longer can we just point to the CMDB that none of us trust as the control for that, but instead have to manage it actively.
Got it. I like the inclusion of threat exposure in the name of the category, because that's always been a part of vulnerability management is, hey, this system's vulnerable, but it's, on a handheld device that store stalkers use, and nobody's got access to it from the internet, so it's not exposed.
Yeah, that what I think is happening, let's be honest, like vulnerability management programs and vulnerability assessment became a compliance-oriented activity. The auditors leaned in and set all these requirements that were not necessarily aligned with, say, security value or actually decreasing risk to the organization. And it became a lot of manual toil and just checking the box for auditors. Now, at the same time, we also knew that there was very real risk there for some subset of those vulnerabilities. And I believe Gartner's doing us all a favor here by changing the lingo and shifting what used to be a compliance-oriented activity into an operational one. And part of their phase is that after discovery and scoping ends up being prioritization and validation as the next two. And in both of those, they have a key component of threat, because part of what the reality is we all have more vulnerabilities than we have remediation capacity to fix. So we've got to go through and prioritize those in some way unique to our given organization. And consideration of the threat that each one of us face is absolutely critical for deciding which ones are most important.
I remember having to stand in for another Gartner analyst when I was at Gartner 20 years ago, mind you, and had to give a presentation on GRC, and I had her slides. This is Roberta Whitty. And so I get on stage, and I looked at slides once, and I get on stage, and the first slide is, elements of GRC. And it was 3 steps. Number 1, identify all your assets. And I remember being on stage and just going, wait a minute, that's impossible. Nobody can do that. You'll spend all of your resources trying to do that job and never succeed, let alone the next 2 steps, which were prioritize or assign value to those assets, and then finally patch them and fix vulnerabilities. Thus, you'd see how critical SEMCO is to CTEM. That makes total sense that you're going to be a critical component of this.
The first spot that it shows up is CVE deduplication. As soon as you start to recognize that you have multiple sources, multiple tools reporting CVEs inside your organization, and you start to go through the process of like, how do you reconcile those different reports and prioritize between them? Like, there are 3 different silos here. I mean, you got, AWS reporting one thing, your traditional VA platform reporting another, and a couple other long tails. Well, it's pretty easy to pull all those into a single spreadsheet, but like, here's the thing, you're going to have redundant coverage. You're going to have overlapping coverage between those 3 different platforms. And as soon as you pull those into the same console, you're going to have duplicate CVEs reported by those different sources. And that creates a whole mess of noise inside your list. And of course, like, it should be relatively straightforward to deduplicate those. But think about the report. Like, you're going to have all the CVE details, and you're going to have something like hostname or an internal device ID from whatever tool it came from. There's not enough data there to cleanly deduplicate those within the scope of just the CVE. How do you do it? Well, you have a strong inventory that itself understands the coverage of every one of those different vulnerability assessment tools. They can use that as the tool to deduplicate CVEs. Yeah, and without that, it gets real messy as soon as you start aggregating all the CVEs into one console.
Right. So somebody could spend half a day patching something, And then next one down in the stack is the same CVE, and it takes time to discover that you've patched it.
Oh, right. Well, yeah, what ends up happening is like the vulnerability management team or your CTEM team opens up the tickets with IT. And then the guys over on the IT side get all frustrated because they're getting make work from the security side. And then that creates these kind of back and forth political battles, and the security team loses political capital inside the organization.
Awesome. Talk to us about the importance of this strong asset foundation. What goes into creating a comprehensive asset inventory? How in the world can you discover everything, right?
Right. Yeah. So, Richard, like you're an industry analyst, help us come up with better words than inventory.
Yeah.
Those
are the stickers I put on my laptop.
We hadn't gotten there yet, but the word inventory has so much baggage associated with it. I've been using the word security inventory, or maybe even the kind of newfangled cybersecurity data fabric, as different labels to avoid some of the baggage of just inventory. That inventory has been control number one for years. We've all told all auditors we've got it under control, and we've all pointed to the CMDB as the tool to accommodate that control. But at the same time, that we've known that the CMDB is wildly inaccurate. I have 5 characteristics of what a security inventory needs. First is it's got to be multiple source. They are not aggregated from, they are not coming from a single different technology, but aggregated from multiple different technologies. This is the core problem with most of our existing inventory, is that they all use a single tech in order to measure inventory. And none of them are wrong per se, but they are a different subset of the whole. The only way in an organization of any size to get a complete inventory is to aggregate the view from multiple different kinds of tech into one view. And of course, as soon as you aggregate it, you've got to go through and deduplicate it, correlate it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a huge amount of work involved in that and doing it well. The second, characteristics is it's got to be a live operational view of what's live in the organization today. Like the source of truth is not something from an administrative process, but live view of what's actually operating on the network today that then you reconcile back to the administrative oriented view of, say, the CMDB that's going through the tickets. Third, it's got to be real time, continuous right now, like not updated only once a ticket goes through the system, not updated once a day, not updated once a week, but right now. Fourth, rich indexing and searching. That, our organizations are complicated places. And as you start slicing and dicing that inventory to rationalize what the denominator of any given KPI coverage should be, like you're going to recognize that like this VA tool should be here, that VA tool should be there, this patch management, platform should be here and there because like you had this acquisition and we haven't migrated them over yet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's 1,000 details. And we can all express the conditions under which we expect those configurations to be present. But being able to tease that out of the data requires rich indexing of all the various attributes and the ability to slice and dice it. And then finally, the fifth one is maintaining the relationships between all the different types of assets. Because all of these different assets are interconnected in complicated ways. That is also essential to understanding the overall inventory, but as well as prioritization and the remediation activity.
Got it. I can imagine just how complicated it all is when you take into account ephemeral assets in the cloud that are coming and going willy-nilly. That's the importance of the real time, up to date.
Oh, and yeah, even the spectrum of what is an ephemeral asset. If it's Kubernetes, the container that is up for seconds, or an auto-scaling instance in EC2 that is up for a few minutes or hours, easy. But what about all your kind of VDI systems that get blown away at the end of a week, or the end of a month? That there's that nothing is cut and dry. But as an industry, we don't even have the language to express these kind of concepts into categories because we've never had the ability to manage it. Like it's a classic Drucker problem. You can't manage what you can't measure. We haven't been able to measure inventory, so now we can't manage it.
Yep. So where do you think this is going? What are the emerging trends that shape the future of this exposure management?
Yeah, so it's going to be interesting to watch. I mean, my view of the world is this is a data problem. The root cause of all these various challenges is siloed data. And the core of CTEM programs and exposure assessment platforms is breaking down all those different silos to give you a single source of truth for all the asset and the vulnerability data. Better data leads to better decisions, which leads to better outcomes for the business. And it turns vulnerability assessment for compliance activity into an operational one. You heard me rattle off here the components of a security inventory or cybersecurity data fabric as distinct from the CMDB or traditional inventory that we depend on. But start going down the process of rationalizing prioritization and remediation and validation. Like threat intelligence is another component that needs to be layered in over the top of all these vulnerabilities. Related to the devices itself, the users associated with it, your organization as a whole, and your overall threat profile. All the kind of the validation components that those platforms that do, we call it attack path mapping or breach and attack simulation. All of that is, at the end of the day, more data related to any given vulnerability as to whether or not it's valid. That helps in the overall prioritization process. You could keep going and extending this kind of idea of more data into that inventory for a very long time. The stuff that we're talking about today is just the start of those silos. Like, we're getting the foundations into place. And I think in the coming years, we're going to see more and more consolidation of what used to be different market segments into one, different tools and products into one, and very deep integrations. In the case where it's maybe not reasonable to have separate products converged into one, at least a deep integration between those products so that you can get the data from any given product that remains different into the overall picture of your exposure assessment platform and to support your CTEM program.
Got it. So, JJ, if you could summarize one takeaway in 60 seconds from our conversation today for CISOs, what would it be?
Yeah. In the scope of this, Vulnerability Management Program 2.0 is here. It's called CTEM, Continuous Threat Exposure Management. The foundation of that is a strong inventory. The only spot I know you can get that today is from a Chasm product that is inventory focused. And upon that common inventory, you layer in vulnerabilities and then have a common prioritization, validation, reporting, and remediation workflows for all vulnerabilities across the organization. I know a thing or two about it, so if anybody's interested in learning more, give us a call.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for that, JJ. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. Really appreciate you listening to our podcast. We hope you took a lot away. And for further information on Sevco and CTEM, please head over to sevcosecurity.com. We'll be back next week with another episode in our podcast series. Until then, make sure you subscribe to this podcast on all major platforms and follow the conversation on our socials at EM360Tech on Twitter and LinkedIn. And for more great daily content, head on over to EM360Tech.com.